I like painting the air around things rather than the thing themselves. It's kind of fun. It's going to be a nice little tree like that in there, I think. This is a neat little tool because look. Woo, that's fun! See that? See how those branches come out? Look at that. I could turn this sideways and even have a limb come out. Welcome back to another episode of the Wet Pastelist. I'm Avon Waters, pastelist. Today I've got multiple wet pastel techniques in one painting. I'm going to also discuss, as I progress with this painting, how I am using value control to create a mood and to paint the air more than the objects themselves. I'll discuss as I go along, work our way towards smaller forms within those large forms, and get near a finished painting with a few more details of light and hue control. So let me begin with the underpainting. And if you're liking the content of these videos, please hit the like button. It goes a long way for others to help find information about wet pastel and value control. This is a 20 by 24 UArt. It has its original surface, and I will be working towards getting more texture onto this surface. Done 4 or 5 of these drawings. I want to try a tree screen with maybe a building behind it. Probably be working from this drawing. This comes from a photograph. Now, those of you that have not done this before, I like to work from a photograph, or if I'm in plein air, I like to work and try to simplify the objects, move objects around that are there, and get the composition the way I want it. The composition is bringing, with all these strong verticals and these horizontals, where you're looking through some trees. My interest is in the light and the spacing in these trees. While this is a shorthand for me, most of you out there, it won't mean anything. But based on my memory, based on my ability to remember this scene when I took the photograph, or if you're doing plein air, you remember these things, and so your mind fills in the blanks. So it's filling in. This is enough information for me to paint from, where most of you would look at this and there's not enough information for you. But I guarantee that if you start getting to the point where you want to simplify your photographs in drawings first, and you start doing this, you too will develop a shorthand that when you look at your drawing, you'll be able to paint from it. That's what I'm doing here, and I'm going to transfer it to a 20 by 24 and use several wet techniques along the way. I'm using large stick charcoal to transfer this drawing onto here, and my goal is to create values that I can follow then with color. Now this is a neighbor's barn. I've looked at this barn for years, coming and going from my, it's probably 2.5 miles from my house. Well, it's not even that. I bet it's less than 2 miles from my house. But it's on my way to my studio. And over the years I've seen the trees change along the fence row. When I come from my studio towards the house, I'm always looking through these trees. And these trees are just a wall of trees. And in flat lands, whether you live in deserts or beaches, beach areas where there's not a lot of dunes, you get a lot of flatlands, and so you've got to learn how to handle those flatlands. And this is one of the ways that I've done it, is by using this foreground and the compound curve, using the Z portion where part of the Z comes out here and then goes back out that way and comes back into the surface. You can draw from the foreground then through the trees and let color and spatial differences guide the eye into and out of the frame for this painting. Now these trees become somewhat stylized, and that's fine because once I wet them down, you'll see how they start to explode and become looking a little bit more like trees that we're familiar with. Now, those of you with palm trees, these will look almost like that. You might not want to go as wild as you'll see me go on some of these trees once I get them developed. But I just love the space and the light that comes in these tree screens. That's something that's always attracted me. Tree screens are difficult to do and pull off. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Just a matter of you got to keep trying, you got to keep experimenting with them. Now, WolfCon, I do a lot of reading. I've read enough of some of the critiques and some of the pastel and painting books that were done. I think they were done by Abrams Press or something, the one that I'm thinking of. But in there, he tends to work on his neighbor's barns and things when he and his wife Emily moved to New England out of the city. He developed friendships with the farmers because he would go out and they would find him painting their barns. The same sort of thing happens if you go out into the country. And this is my neighbor, but it could just as easily be a barn that I'm out with friends painting plein air with or something. But I just try to keep the shapes large. And you notice if you squint, this shape here, by the time I get this kind of filled in this area, this is a wedge going this way. So there'd be another wedge coming out this way. And then another little wedge coming out this way. When I'm done, there'll be some movement through these tree branches and things like that, and the darkness of the sky here and the lightness here. It's a constant movement right to left because of all these strong verticals. You've got to constantly think of composition. I just got done doing a 3-part series on composition to introduce people to the concepts of the compound curve and thirds and some of those beginning concepts for composition for my students. So now I'm going to wet this down with some alcohol. We'll start to get a few drips. We'll start to get some firming up and enlarging some of these shapes. For this, I've got my favorite brush, the chip brush from the big box hardware store. About 69 cents. And then this is out of one of those Michaels art packs where you get like 25 brushes for $6 or something. So I'm working on sanded finishes here, and a lot of times if it's not sanded, I've already gessoed and got clear gesso rough pumice finishes. So it'll eat up brushes in a heartbeat. But I am starting, I don't normally necessarily do this, I'm starting with this thin brush because I want some of these edges like this. By the time this alcohol wash dries, it'll set some of those in place so that when I use the bigger chip brush, I won't make those edges disappear so much. So it's just a way to help me maybe accomplish some things in the underpainting without washing everything completely away and just end up with big blobs. So that's the only reason I'm using this little brush right now, is it just sets these things in place. And like I said, I'm using alcohol. When you're working in the studio, that alcohol, it really doesn't matter whether it's 70, 90, 80%, 96%, because basically it's not going to dry too fast. The only time the alcohol percentage really matters too much is when you're out in plein air on a hot, humid day or something, If you start to use 90 and 96% alcohol or 91%, it may dry too fast for you. So that's a personal preference. Ready for my big brush. Now, because I'm using charcoal's near the 1 and 2 range, depending on whether you let some of this charcoal show through. You know, you might get a 1 or 2 value range out of it, maybe a 3. And I can go into some of these dark areas and wash on the charcoal to bring this down, because although this is beige, it's probably in the 8, 9, or 10 range. So we've got a scale of 1 to 10, starting at 1 and 2 and then jumping to 10. So the goal here is to do these washes and to create some midtones. So we're spreading some of this out. Once I get a lot of this charcoal on a brush, I dip it in the alcohol and come up in here and tone down some of this 8, 9, and 10 and try to get it closer to the 6, 7, or 8 range. Our colors will do this too, gradually bring these tones together. There's nothing wrong with working in a scale of 1 to 10, but I find when I want to create moody pictures, I find that using the tonalist techniques to bring the scale, narrow the scale down to just 3 or 4, sometimes just 1 or 2 in the dark range, and then there might be a split where we're 1 and 2 in the midtones and highlights. So those are some of the things that aren't really part of this demonstration, other than just to let you know that that's what's happening here. Is I'm trying to bring down some of those scales and not have it so wide, because I'm after a mood. I'm pre-visualizing. I did a whole series video once on pre-visualization, and in my mind I've got an idea, but it's not a firm idea. I let the painting tell me where it wants to go, but I got kind of an idea of the mood and of the atmosphere I'm after. I like painting the air around things rather than the thing themselves. That lets me kind of, once you've done enough artwork, you kind of get an idea of where you want to head something to, whether it's the color palette, or it might be just as simple as, oh, I want this to be dark, I want this to be a night scene, I want this to be a midday scene. Those sort of pre-visualizations of what you think things in this painting should look like are not bad things to have. The only time it becomes bad is where you force the painting into it. If later on at another stage this painting tells you it wants to go a different direction, if you fight it, it'll show. You know, these are subjective sort of things. These are decisions that as an artist you have to make. You always have to make decisions. This is not something that just is automatic. It's not something that, oh, this thing's going to be ultra realistic and full of detail, and I'm going to have a little man walking along the path here. I start out that way 9 times out of 10. For some people it works, but not for me. I've got to let this painting tell me where it wants to go. And right now you're seeing some nice drips and things. Those are all things of interest for me as this painting progresses. And see, I'm going to really darken that down a little bit more there. I want this to be more of a solid wedge before this wedge and this wedge. But we've got our wedge down in here that's wide, so I want to make sure I keep it nice and wide so it reminds me that this is the thick edge and this is the thin side over here. So that makes this the thick light edge going to thin. This makes this the thick dark edge going to thin. Another wedge this way coming down, going to thin. So I want to keep track of that. Get that wedge firmed up in there. That wedge firmed up in there. All right, let that dry, and then I'm going to get a little color in there, and then we'll add more texture in a secondary wet process as I start to block in color. On smaller versions of this, and I have several that were studies for demonstration, this particular piece has enough open area because it's 24 by 24 that I can create some distance behind this farm scene and setting that's beyond this fence row that's here. There's the fence row, there's some foreground going up, there's the barn, there's typically some buildings over in here, but I opted not to use them. So we can create some open space behind this and give it a little bit more depth. These are just place setter colors. They're bright, they're not toned down, they're just out there in the ether, so to speak. And when I mix these colors, they're going to darken down quite a bit, especially once the brush gets a little polluted with some of the darker colors I'm going to put in here. I'm going to use some yellow over this and create some grays up in here for now. I'll mix that and it'll go gray here, I think. Just there's a gray violet that'll help that too. There's no texture on here other than the sanded paper, so I'm not getting a lot of layering. It's just a pretty blank canvas at this point. Not a lot happening texturally or in layers here yet. But we're working our way there. This is a fluorescent color out of Diana Townsend's Terrage, whatever how you say it. Get some dark slate in there. This is a violet. This is out of the 3 value box. When this is wetted down, it probably will go a little darker. And this will go darker, so we'll gradually be bringing these values together here. I want to reestablish some of these darks up in here that washed out. I'm going to stick some red-orange over that, a darker value red-orange. We'll bring it back into scale here in a minute. It's kind of fun. There might be something out in here. Just a little dab. Probably looking pretty gaudy right now, but when we get the wet stuff on here, I'm going to use some clear gesso, I think. Clear gesso is going to help darken these things down and get some of that gaudiness gone. And again, we're just working in big shapes. I'm just working those big shapes out until I can get some texture in there. And when I get the texture in there, then is when we can start. When the texture is in there, I can start working on refining, making trees look a little more like trees, bushes a little more like bushes, grasses more like grasses, sky a little more like sky, but in the color range and choices that I'm making. So there'll be the right values eventually, and the right shapes, with shapes in between the shapes, and shapes on top of shapes, and the layering. So it's just the process to get from beginning to end and give you an idea of how I approach today's painting. I'm kind of liking that. Yeah, I haven't even messed it up yet. and smeared it. Let's smear it a little bit. What do you think? Just knock a little of that dust off of there. The reason I knock the dust off is when I don't already have texture on there, which this doesn't have other than the sanded paper itself, is you get too much dust on there and the pastel will repel whatever wet materials you put on there, whether it's water, alcohol, or whatever. You've got to overcome the surface tensions of the pastel in order to get it to stick. It's going to be a nice little tree line back in there, I think. The studio has a nice air filter on it, so the air filter drags it that way, away from me as opposed to this way towards me. Alright, we've already started to smear it up pretty good. Let's get some clear gesso on there, and I may have to fix this a little bit. We'll see. I might just spray some fixative on there. I think I'm going to do that just enough to fix some of these shapes in place, but maybe not so much that when I start putting the clear gesso on that I won't have some pastel to smear around. This is Final Fix from Spectrafix. It's a beeswax, milk casein, a high percentage of alcohol, so it dries pretty rapidly. Get some of those highlight areas a little bit there. Let that dry. Then we're ready to smear some of that pastel that's loose around. Sometimes I start with a pre-gessoed panel that's blank. This time I didn't. It has its advantages either way. The more you work with wet mediums, the more you'll be able to make some of those decisions in advance. In the beginning, you just need to try, well, let's try a panel that's heavily textured with clear gesso. This is clear gesso in my little favorite cheap brush from the big box hardware store that's 59 or 69 cents. I'm starting in some of the lighter areas. A lot of times I'll still use clear gesso even though I started with a gessoed panel, but in those instances I'm not putting it on near as thick as I am like right now. I'm wanting to retain what's underneath more, but at this particular point this is just really a blocked in painting, so I can recreate anything that gets destroyed or gets hidden. This will all look gray, but it will dry kind of a frosty clear, so you'll still see some of these things if I don't smear them around too much. I'll get some brush strokes in some of these areas that are just dabbed on because I want maybe sky and some texture areas underneath these things to show through. You'll see when this is dry that it really has a frosty, really blurry. Remember how I was saying I want a mood? As these colors blend with these brushes, they will come down in value. That separation we had that I talked about with the grayscale being 1 to 10 because of the black charcoal and the white or beige light colored paper, that all disappears as you start to blend these colors and these edges together. That separation, that big separation between black and white just starts to get narrower and narrower as you put layers on using this gesso. So that's another advantage of gessoing over this. I'm going to go to the bigger brush now, and I'm going to get into some of these darks and really start to blend some of those edges together. So I've got my lights and I got my middle tones kind of done with that smaller brush, and I'll have to blend into some of those edges there. Now that Spectrafix, it held back on just enough of that pastel that I can go in here and I can pick some of it up. If I go over places with the brush more than if I sit there and you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. This brush and these bristles will dissolve what little finish that Spectrafix put on there. So you've got to be careful, and again, that's one of those things that as you do this, you'll find how much scrubbing that you can do and get away with, and it becomes another tool in your toolbox, because at some point you're like, oh, okay, this area I need to scrub because I want to get a little more blur into this area. This area I don't want to scrub because I want to keep it kind of separated from that area over there. So those are the sort of things that practice and using this technique will over time start to add tools to your toolbox. And you can start to see some really interesting areas in here. Add some brush strokes going the way that the tree limbs might go out, the way the tree limbs might go up into the sky and come down as branches come down. So those are the things. Now there's little hairs and bristles come off, and you pick those out. Otherwise you'll end up with little places where there's ridges, you don't want them. There's a tree that, look at that, that's so much better than just the blob that was there. There'll be some bushes that come along underneath here in this fence row. Remember those used to look like almost palm trees? And I said that as we go along, they'll get spread out and they'll become more realistic like trees. This is what I meant. As you put other wet layers on and you drag some of those darks into the lights and things, you'll get some of that separation that you were looking for, and those trees start to get more of a shape that you're familiar with. So if any of you are doing palm trees out there, remember how they look like palm trees? If you wanted to keep palm trees shapes, you would have to start with something much smaller, or at least go back and reestablish them as you began to paint and destroyed them and made them too big. You'd have to go back and reestablish their palm-like shapes and their narrowness that palm trees get. I've got a place down in South America in Colombia, and there's a lot of palm-like trees down, and there's many different types of palms, and I wish I could. The locals don't know what they're called. Like, we know what a maple is and an oak tree, but they don't know one palm from another. At least the ones I end up asking, like, what tree? I'm painting a tree, and I go, what tree is that? I don't know, it's a palm tree. Probably some grasses in this barnyard, grasses and weeds, so I keep some of these strokes vertical. And near the end, when we want to simulate some of those bases of plants and things, those vertical strokes will help me create areas where I can put stems and roots and things like that. All right, we'll let that dry, and then we'll get ready to go to the next step and block in and work our way. We're still in the beginning stages, but we'll work our way. Now we've got some bigger shapes, we're getting some blurred edges, we're getting some trees that are starting to have some shape like trees. So we'll begin to put in some of those areas in there with some color, and those colors will start to modulate and create some definition and some smaller shapes within the bigger shapes. That's our next step. Okay, back in a few. Okay, the clear gesso has dried. Just a reminder, we started out with a drawing that came from a photograph, took it to a stage using charcoal and alcohol. I blocked this in, and Then I applied the clear gesso after I blocked in the basic colors. And you can see from the clear gesso that the values have significantly shifted a little bit, mixing some of those darker values. The values have been brought closer to one another with the application of the clear gesso. And here you can see the values, the separation between light and dark is much greater. So going for atmosphere, this is what I'm after. So my trees right now, the tree trunks are pretty straight. I want to give them some character before we're done. That charcoal is handy. It'll mix and mud up any color I want. It will create a shade. When you add black to any color, you get a shade. When you add white, you get tints. I don't like how this is a little slight wedge pointing in, which is kind of good, but boy, it's just, well, when you live in flat lands like I do, there are a lot of straight plains. But even though just because I live here doesn't mean I can't undulate this just a little bit more in places and raise it up here, raise it up there. Looks like there's a tree wanting to come out between here and there. Let's see if I can accentuate that mark. I'll use that chart. Between this line and this line. These trees, some of these are coming down in here. Like originally this tree was coming out of here in different locations to not make that a straight line. That's a little more interesting than having those just in the fence row. Just because it's there doesn't mean, it's in a fence row. Just because it's in a fence row doesn't mean you can't change things. Especially when you live in flat areas, whether it's a desert, sandy, open beaches without dunes. Everything's fair game. And what do we have here? We have our Z composition continuing. It kind of flattens out here. That's why I want to raise that up so we continue some of that movement of the eye. It's just a subtle movement. Don't forget when you do a compound curve, flatten out, and it should flatten out because you want different shapes here, here, and here, and here. So you don't want a straight S where everything is equal. But the compound curve using the Z composition, it comes out past the borders, goes past the borders and comes back in. Your eye will read that and follow it out and will follow it back in. That's too bright of a color, too bright of a value for in there. But we'll tone it down. We, meaning you, me, and all of us, are working together on this. This is our painting. We shall overcome. A brush hair. That's the one thing about those cheap brushes. These textures will grind them down. But every now and then you have to go through with a palette knife or something and pull those brush hairs out of there. One of my favorite little palette knives. Look how thin that thing is. I don't know where I got that. But yeah, sometimes you get those hairs in there and they are in the wrong place. Sometimes they're in the right place. They make nice little thin lines for weeds or tree branches and things. So you might be judicious in how you remove them. Like that one, I might just leave that one because there probably will be some grasses up in there. And this is a neat little tool because look, you can scratch, I don't know if you can see that, but it's scratching through those darks. So if you wanted to have, fine grasses in a finish, at the finish stage, you could use a tool like this to get fine little grasses in there. And every time I go across this sanded paper, it's probably making a sharper and sharper point. I'm going to get some of those red violets. I'm pulling from my values 1, 2, and 3. This violet is a 3. I'm going to put it in as kind of an underpainting in the shadows, and then when I go over it with some red oranges or some blues, it will tone down. It's pretty bright. It's a lot of saturation of color there. Here will probably be some sort of undergrowth, so I want the violets down in there, and I'll go to a red violet or a blue violet by the time I'm done. But right now, this is just a layering effort to get some of the color that I know I'm going to be in there. So I'm pre-visualizing. We talked about pre-visualization before, but I'm pre-visualizing some of those things that are happening here. And this is where a good knowledge of color and color theory really will help your painting. Knowing color theory and how the colors are going to react with one another in advance, you're able to pre-visualize the end product of these mixings. Brown, a lot of browns are part of the orange family, and so I have oranges up in here. And you can see how that tones that down. Brings the value up just a little bit. This is probably a value 2. You turn it to gray. And now it's starting to let some of those darks show through under the texture. The texture is there, and those darks will start to show through underneath, and the violet will show through, but it will be muted quite a bit. So you get some of these nice red violets starting to build in there. They're not red yet, but they will be. And there'll be blue violet before I'm done too. By dragging this color, remember I said these are too bright for the area that it's in? By dragging this from the shadows across that highlight, it tones it down and makes it part of the family of colors that eventually will be there. Now, people who paint using the side of the pastel and using marks, they get a similar effects, but because I like to use texture and let these layers, as I bring them in, start to speak to me, then that's what I really enjoy, is that layering effect. Just building this painting. I think I said earlier how somebody commented, well, why don't you just not do an underpainting so much and just start with the colors you want. The problem with that is I don't always see the colors I want until I go through the layering process. Those colors aren't showing themselves to me. I probably would do some blending here of some sort to moosh this up a little bit. Getting kind of spotty, and by blending with a brayer or some other material, I might be able to get what I'm after. I've got a number 1 blue. It's probably a little dark for all these areas, but some of the areas that are going to have some darker shadows, this will cool those areas down, since violet is a warmer color. This is my little tiny brayer. It's a 1/2 inch brayer. Just Google print brayers, 1/2 inch, and you'll find several sellers of these things. We can create all sorts of little edges that will inform. Look at that. Oh, look at that. I need to get in there and show you those mark making and how that is working. Let me zoom in on that. This is a good example for you to see how using this tool will make small and wide and thin marks. Some of those will get covered up as I work in the sky. but others won't. Others I'll follow, others will inform the later parts of this painting. Ooh, that's fun! Oh, now I'm getting layers of tree limbs overlapping one another. Or not tree limbs, but the leafy branches of trees overlapping. So this is really informing what the detail in this painting will become later on. Yeah. See that? See how those branches come out? Look at that. I could turn this sideways and even have a limb come out. So that's what's so neat about this. This is a super little tool, and the way you use it, you can create broad strokes, you can create narrow branches, but this is the way I break up these large spaces and then come back later and start to use color to separate one group of leaves over another group of leaves. So that's a super little tool to use. I'm going to continue to start to do some of this blending. Okay, I've switched to my hand here because of those oranges I put in. I want to blur those edges up a little bit. I still haven't fixed this area here. I didn't put any pastel yet on these darker areas, so that's my next step, and then we'll have everything ready to start breaking up these shapes. Ooh, I really like what's happening along these edges right in here. It's nice and fuzzy, very atmospheric, very atmospheric. See if by the end if I can keep some of that quality. I mean, it still has a roundness to it, but you know, it's got really a lot of light and what I call air just intruding over its edges. That right in there is something that I really strive when I try to paint the air. I really strive to keep some of that. Sometimes I reach this point and I stick it on the wall, and what I call my fermentation wall, and I'll pass it for weeks at a time, and maybe a month or two down the road pull it off the wall and know exactly what to do. I'm going to stop right here. I've worked in this area. I've gotten this area somewhat the way that I'm pre-visualizing it and the way some of the ghosts have done. I still have a lot of work over in here. The barn has kind of gone a little bit off its foundations. I'm getting some layering in here. I'm going to stick this up on the wall, but I think it's far enough along that you can see. I've gotten some character into some of these. There's one that's still pretty straight, and some of these have to come down through here yet. I think you're seeing a little bit of how I've been able to take some of those ghosts from the wet process. I'm guessing this is probably still a little bright through there, or at least up in here. But when it sits on the fermentation wall, I'll know how and where to put some of these dark and light areas in more perspective. But we're getting there. It's nearing the end of the middle stages, and it'll be on to the finish after I make some decisions, sitting back for a few days to look at this. Well, that's it. We took that painting to at least the end of the middle stage, maybe the beginning of the finish stage. From this point forward, it's a lot of reevaluation and looking at where I can create opportunities for light, value shifts, and control. I still have to clean up that barn, which kind of fell off its foundations near the end, but get that cleaned up. And then over the course of the next few weeks, that painting will be taken to finish. So hopefully this gave you a good idea, and we'll be back next week with another topic. And if you're liking these, please hit the like button. It goes a long way. Take care, everybody. Until next time, happy painting. Bye-bye.